Felicia Feaster, welcome to TCM.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I can't wait to get into our subject tonight. You've also written extensively for HGTV. You've written a lot about gardening, which led to your book, The Goth Garden, The Mystery, Beauty and Lore of Dark Gardening. I love this subject, but I think we should start with, what is a goth garden?
Sure. I was a garden editor at one point in my career. So I started to see this trend popping up on Instagram and TikTok for these very vibey, dark gardens with lots of deep purple and red and almost black plants and decor that was very much inspired by a Victorian aesthetic.
Mm.
So I wrote a couple stories about that, and that was how a publisher found me to ask me. Simon & Schuster asked me if I wanted to write a book about goth gardens, and of course I was thrilled to do that. It was such a deep dive into not only the aesthetics of goth gardens. I talk about 50 plants that you can use in your own goth garden to create that vibe, but it's also about the origins of goth gardens
Mhm.
in the 19th century in Gothic literature, Frankenstein, and all these novels that we think of as, goth, but also the plant hunting that happened in the Victorian era,
Mm.
when most of the plants we have in our gardens now originated from plant hunters traveling to Asia and South America and bringing plants back to England. So it was this very formative time that kind of set a tone. Queen Victoria, she introduced the idea of mourning garb and what you would wear when you were honoring someone's death, in her case, her husband Albert's.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about your book, because it is a mixture of history. Like you said, there's an encyclopedia of 50 different goth plants. You also have a lot of references, as you mentioned, to literature.
Mhm.
Can you tell us about that and how the Gothic novels of the time found their way into your book about goth gardens?
Gothic literature is very much about the past returning. The past is never really past.
Mm.
It's a definite genre, but it's also a mood, I think you could say, and something that trickles down into those plants that are, very dark in color, that kind of, again, go back to the mourning garb of the Victorian era. But also, a real goth garden, in my opinion, has a lot of poisonous and parasitic and carnivorous plants, which kind of play into that sense in Gothic literature of nature being both awe-inspiring, but also frightening in certain cases.
Mm.
You think of the English moors and the sort of desolation of that kind of landscape that you see in so many films and
Mm.
how that conveys a sensibility. So nature is a storyteller, and it really conveys meaning to us in sometimes very subtle ways.
And that brings us to the first film we're going to see, Great Expectations. Talk about a moody film. This is an adaptation of the novel by Charles Dickens from 1946, directed by David Lean. What are the scenes that we should look out for here in terms of goth gardens?
Well, speaking of moors, so the film really begins with our main character, Pip, running through the Kent moors to go to the graveyard where his parents are buried. So he climbs this stone wall to visit the grave, to place really the only instance of a living flower in the scene. So there are plenty of trees that have lost their leaves, a lot of scary sounds of the wind passing through the bushes. Everything is very sparse and a little bit ominous.
Hmm.
It's an incredibly shadowy scene. But that tiny, fragile little bouquet of flowers
Yeah.
conveys a certain hopefulness and a certain spirit that talks about Pip. The graveyard is obviously very much a goth setting,
Hmm.
and it was a transitional point in Victorian times. We went from those churchyard graveyards to more of a garden cemetery. The reason for those cemeteries arising was because they were becoming overcrowded and unsanitary. There was too much, at work in these church graveyards. So they kind of did a little pivot and made garden cemeteries much more pastoral and pleasant with lots of plants and flowers. So you wouldn't have to import a tiny little bouquet like Pip. You could be surrounded by, your loved ones, but also by the splendor of nature. So it was a
Mm.
nice kind of change of attitude in terms of mourning and the loss of loved ones.
Well, Felicia, thank you so much for joining me on TCM tonight.
Thank you.
And let's get into the film. Here it is from 1946, Great Expectations. Well, Felicia, such a fabulous, moody film, Great Expectations, really takes you into that Gothic world of the Victorian age.
Absolutely. Great Expectations isn't a pure Gothic. It does have Gothic elements. It's also a Bildungsroman about a young boy's growth,
Hmm.
but it's certainly in David Lean's hands, full of Gothic touches, which I love.
Well, we have to talk about Miss Havisham, which is another moment that you see the kind of elements of what makes a goth garden.
So his first glimpse of Miss Haversham's home is her garden, which is not so much a garden as maybe what was once a garden until neglect took over. You think of Miss Haversham's interior of her space with all of the cobwebs,
Mm.
and for me, English ivy is the cobweb of the outdoors. So you see, as Estella leans out the window to ask who's at the gate, this English ivy crawling up the side of the home. It's the most Gothic touch you can have in the natural world, as far as I'm concerned. It shows a certain neglect and this voraciousness of nature, how soon it takes over a space when it's not tended.
Yeah, it's just that decay, which again speaks to the decay of the mental state of Miss Havisham. But I've read that a lot of modern day goth gardeners really try to add that sense of like decay and wildness into their garden, even though they are tending it.
Absolutely. Well, I, for instance, have a dead tree in my garden. It has no leaves left, but I still, trim the little stray branches, and it's got sort of a skeletal look in the space. And I think people can really lean into that element of decay with letting their hydrangeas, once they dry out, just remain, not cutting them away just because their life force is spent. I think there are lots of ways to lean into that Gothic in the garden that you can see, in Great Expectations.
You're also talking about how at that time the graveyards really moved from the church into garden cemeteries. And I was thinking about how that really speaks to an element of goth gardens, which is inviting the life and death cycle in. It's like the things that die nourish the soil, new things grow from it. And that's all gardening is, isn't it? Life and death.
Absolutely. I think it can be, because of that, a very healing, soothing space, because
Mm.
we don't have a lot of opportunity in our day-to-day lives to really meditate on those ideas, to be in touch with, the fact that gardens are microcosms of, what we experience as human beings, right? Beginnings and ends. So
Hmm.
I love that about the goth garden.
Yeah, and I love being in a garden. I love gardening myself, but I would not say I have a green thumb. What's your advice?
My theory is everyone has something they can grow. You just have to find the right plant for you.
Okay.
But I would recommend castor bean because it is incredibly easy to grow. You just stick a seed into the ground and it will pop up in a matter of weeks.
Poisonous, though.
It is lethal. It is, the seed pods of castor bean are 6,000 times more lethal than cyanide.
Wow.
So it's been used in political assassinations. It was considered as a chemical weapon in World War I and World War II, and you can grow it in your garden. How fun is that?
Right. I love that. That's this element of danger. Like these plants might kill you, but they also look beautiful at the same
Right. It's a
time.
little story, and that's what the Goth Garden is also about, the stories behind plants.
Mm.
Both their deadly meaning, but also just their folklore and how people have thought about them over time.
Well, Felicia, thank you so much for being on TCM tonight.
Thank you.
And I can't wait to talk more goth gardens with you after the break when we watch a 1946 film noir.
Next on TCM, The Big Sleep, then Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and later, The Thing from Another World. Space out with TCM tonight.